Bella Bobs. Come on then, you're going to be a film star. No, gentle. Gentle. Shh. Gently. Just gently. Hi there and welcome to video 7. And this is Bella. And she wants to be a film star. Welcome back. This is video 7 in our series. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about eunuchs and to create a historical and a bit of context for understanding the stories of eunuchs in the Bible and some of the teaching on eunuchs in the church and in scripture. And to do that, I've really spent probably the last 10 years studying history and anthropology, both biblical and secular, and just want to paint or tell a little bit of story around the history of eunuchs from beginning to today. So the church is obviously concerned about the life of Israel and the life of the Jews and the formation of Israel as a nation from disparate tribes into a people and a nation, into a united collective. And the context of that was various warring tribes and nations, empires waging for dominance. And Israel was birthed in a cradle of these pagan cultures. And war was normal, it was a way of life. And it seems to be that in early history that the warring nations would castrate their enemies on the battlefield as a means of terrorizing their enemy. And it sent a very powerful and shuddering message to the hearts of their enemy, that saying, don't mess with us because this is how you'll end up. But over time, it seems that a practice emerged of castrating the enemy as a means of making them subservient and docile, of demonstrating dominance and oppression. And this developed into a culture to the extent that by the time of the Assyrian Empire, eunuchs were being made on almost an industrial scale. And you learn from animal husbandry that in castration, it renders the creature docile. And it had become very much a culture. And what emerges through, as we move from Assyrian, Babylonian into the Persian Empire, which brings us up to date with the Book of Esther. And in the Book of Esther, you get a real glimpse into life of eunuchs in royal courts and in dynasties, where they served the kings and queens. And far from just being menial servants, many of them rose to prominence. And when you read secular histories of the same period, and you can look at eunuchs in Chinese history, where again eunuchs were made on an industrial scale, and Korean history, that the eunuchs rose to such power that there were actually rebellions among the ruling classes and the ruling families, the other wealthy, powerful tribes and families, because they were so unhappy with the power that had been given to court eunuchs. So then one has to ask the question, why did these eunuchs rise to such prominence? Why were they so trusted within royal courts? And there is a number of reasons for that. One of the roles that the eunuchs played, which we see in the Book of Esther, is as guards, as court guardians and soldiers who would guard both the king and the king's bedchamber, which is where the eunuch arrives from, because eunuch means the chamberlain or the chamber keeper, which led to the word eunuch being used for not just a castrated male, but for a high-ranking official in royal service, became the chamberlain, or in Greek, eunuch. So the eunuchs rose to power, but why were they trusted to such an extent? One of the reasons is that they were never seen as a threat because they couldn't procreate, because they couldn't have children, because they couldn't be a threat to the queen, to the king's wives, or to the queen, or to any of the king's harem. And a king might have a huge harem with many, many women and many wives. And so the eunuchs were trusted because they were considered to be impotent, and therefore they couldn't have offspring. They couldn't create a rival dynasty with the queen. So that gave them huge access. And a saying from ancient times is that the eunuch has the ear of the king. Not the ears of the king, but the ear of the king, which is suggestive of a whispering, of an intimacy, of a confidence. The eunuch has the ear of the king. I think that's highly significant to understanding even Jesus' teaching on the eunuchs. But another reason that the eunuchs were elevated to be counselors and confidants, advisors to the king and to the dynasties, was that they were recognized to carry wisdom. And where does this wisdom originate from? Because wisdom doesn't follow a binary logic. Wisdom often transcends logic and reason to find deeper truths. And one of the reasons that the eunuchs were deemed to embody wisdom was because they had the ability to think in both the masculine and the feminine realms. They understood totally the masculine realm, because that had been who they were, even as boys. But through the trauma that they'd been led through the child abuse of castration, through their subservience, and through losing all their male privilege, they gained an insight into the feminine role, the feminine psyche, and feminine understanding. And so they held the two, which in ancient culture would have been very much almost conflicting paradigms, where women were deemed almost as chattels, as belongings, as possessions, as little better than slaves to a patriarch in a male-dominated society. And the eunuchs were able to enter into both worlds and understand them. And what's hugely significant in the Book of Esther is that Hegai, who was the guardian and the senior guard of King Xerxes' harem, who guarded the concubines, and Shashgaz, who overlooked Esther's beauty treatments for 12 months, it was they who prepared Esther for the throne. And they taught Esther how to understand the king. They knew and understood both the heart of the king, this dominant, patriarchal, and almost terrorizing leader who could execute people on a whim. They had his confidence, they had his ear, and they understood him. But they were also able to understand a young, virgin girl who was probably in her adolescence. And they were able to coach her and teach her and show her how to win the king's favour. And if that's not an insight into the teaching of Jesus on eunuchs, then I don't know what is. When Matthew teaches about the eunuchs in Matthew 19, he talks about those who were born eunuchs, those who were made eunuchs by others, and those who choose to become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And in talking about those born eunuchs, he is, I believe, talking about those that today we would call intersex. And it's very obvious when he's talking about those who were made eunuchs by others, he's talking about the practices of the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek and the Roman empires, all of whom made eunuchs on an industrial scale for different purposes. But what's interesting is I believe the Book of Esther would have been really trending in Jesus' time. I believe it was written as between 200 and 400 years before Christ. And if you understand how long it would take to copy the story and for it to spread through the Jewish diaspora, I believe it would have been very topical in Jesus' day. As Jesus was learning, as he was studying the scriptures, he probably would have been very familiar with the Book of Esther, and he would have been familiar with the eunuch and the story of the eunuch and the history of the eunuchs. Josephus records that King Herod the Great had 4 eunuchs in his court. So Jesus was probably familiar with eunuchs, probably had even had eunuch friends or disciples. So when you start to dig deep, when you start to understand the eunuch, you can begin then to start to understand Jesus' teaching. But trying to understand Jesus' teaching on the eunuchs before you've done the research is almost pointless. So that's just a little snapshot of some of the study that I've been doing over the last few years. Some of the insights I've gained into scripture and into the lives of eunuchs and culture. I'm going to share a little bit more on another video, but I hope it sets a framework, a background. And it ties in really with what we were talking about when I introduced the subject of transgender in a historical context in video 2. That actually Christianity has from very early on sought to erase the eunuch, the non-binary, those who transgress, those who don't fit into the strict male or female. And really today, the church doesn't have any language or any narrative, any contemporary understanding of the lives of eunuchs. And so when the church tries to interpret scripture, tries to teach on scripture, it's really at a loss. And I think one of the things that I want to bring to the church is some contextual perspective when we try and understand scripture and actually see that within scripture, God's heart for the eunuch and for the non-binary, for those who are other and outside the norm, outside the binary of male and female, his heart is huge and inclusive and radical, and he welcomes us in. So that's really the end of video 7. I probably took longer than I wanted to. Thank you for listening, and if you've got questions or thoughts, please do get in touch, add comments, and I'll try and come back to you. But lots of love from us, from me, and look forward to seeing you in video 8.